All right. So here we go. We're gonna go back through Galatians here. Um, we're gonna catch up back where we left off here in a moment. Again, this is Galatians in Depth, which is part of our Gear series. We talked a little bit about Paul, and we're going to go into that more. We're also going to talk a little bit about um, Judaism and the Galatians themselves, and analyze a couple things about Paul. All this stuff is important when building up a proper um, background or understanding of the book of Galatians, because you need to know who's writing it, who he's writing it to, and what are some of the issues and what are the things that people believed. A lot of times that is lacking sorely from much of the work today you find on the book of Galatians, and lots of little or subtle things are missed out on. And so it's really tragic, but goal here is to try and correct some of that stuff. So let's catch up where we left off, which we ended talking a little bit about Paul's training. We talked about how Peter said that he was misunderstood. We're talking about proselytes in Judaism. We talked about the school of Hillel and the school of Shammai and the 18 articles. And yeah, this is where we're going to pick up. So we were talking about the 18 articles, which were the rulings enacted by the house of Shammai on Judaism as a whole, how many of those of the school of Hillel were actually killed to enforce these rulings, which included the separations between Jews and Gentiles. Now going forward, we're going to talk a little bit about circumcision. This is pretty interesting here because there's many rabbis and there's many of those in Judaism today that aren't really fully educated on this matter. They're not really educated on conversion. They're not really fully educated on the topic we're going to touch on, circumcision. And that may upset some to hear that, or even maybe those in Judaism that say, well, what do you mean? I've sat over many a bris and, so on and so forth. That's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is what Judaism teaches, what has taught on the need for a Gentile to be circumcised, and what the text actually says. Because the issue is, most modern rabbis, they don't have a lot of Gentiles knocking at their doors going, hey, how do I become a Jew? Or how do I worship the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? They don't have a lot of that. Sometimes it happens, sometimes, more often in Reform Judaism, but sometimes it happens where a Catholic marries a Jew, and so on and so forth, or an agnostic, maybe they marry a Jew and they have to go through some kind of conversion that way, and they convert to be married, and so on and so forth, but it's pretty rare. Now today that's becoming more and more of an issue. You're seeing a huge thing. You're seeing this whole movement, Ger movement, or the movement that's larger than that is what we'd call the Noahide movement, B'nai Noach, the children of Noah. You're seeing a lot of that where you have Gentiles that maybe they came out of Christianity, maybe they never were Christians, but they're curious about Jewishness and Judaism and the God of Abraham, and they want to know more. And so they're seeing more of that, and they're also seeing, from Messianic Judaism and Hebrew roots, you're seeing some of those people now interacting with Jews more. And so it's becoming more and more of this issue for Judah to have to know these things. And there are rabbis out there that have really started looking at these issues and saying, hey, some of the things that we were kind of traditionally taught, or that weren't really focused much on when we went through our schooling, our religious education to be a rabbi, these things were kind of left out, or we were kind of given like a really simplified answer because it didn't really matter. And now we really need to know because it's becoming more of an issue. Okay, so this is from the Talmud. Okay, it's from the tractate Yavamoth, 46a. It says, Ar-Hayyabi Abba once came to Gabala, and where he observed Jewish women who conceived from proselytes who were circumcised but had not performed the required ritual ablution, which that ritual ablution is actually mikvah or immersion, or as Christians would call it, baptism. He also noticed that idolaters were serving Jewish wine and Israelites were drinking it. He also saw the idolaters were cooking lupines and the Israelites ate them, but he did not speak to them on the matter at all. In other words, he saw this going on and didn't say anything. He then called, however, upon our Yohanan, who instructed him, Go and announce that their children are bastards, and their wine is forbidden as Nesek wine, and their lupines are forbidden as food cooked by idolaters, or idolaters, because they are ignorant of the Torah. Now, this is part of a greater discussion, so deductions as to reasoning as to why our Yochanan would respond the way he did should be withheld. In other words, I'm just giving you a snapshot, and so this rabbi comes in and says, go say these things to these people. It'd be very easy for someone to read this to get their hackles up and say, oh, that just doesn't seem right, why is he being so judgmental and stuff. You don't understand the full argument. I haven't given it all to you, so just reserve judgment on any of those things. The relevance lies in the issue of the Jewish women who had children with proselytes that though they were circumcised, they were not baptized, to use the Christian term. Here, immersion in water is held to be of a higher value than circumcision. In other words, they were Jewish women, they married men who had a physical circumcision but were not immersed in water. And this rabbi's judgment is they're not really proselytes because they were not immersed in water. Now, wait a minute. Someone would go, wait a minute. The Torah actually says circumcision. The Torah doesn't really command water immersion anywhere. Why are they so upset about water immersion? Don't you think that circumcision would be sufficient? That's the one the Torah says, right? I mean, that in Messianic Judaism, in the Hebrew roots movement in particular, is so like letter of the law about things. They would go, it's not in the Torah. Well, guess what? Immersion in water for conversion is not in the Torah either, but yet Yeshua himself says, he who believes and is immersed shall be saved. So you have a problem, and there are other verses that talk about immersion in water. So evidently our apostles and our first century Jewish brethren who started this faith that we follow, they believed in the importance of water immersion. Apparently, possibly as much as this rabbi here. So again, when I talk about things like people need to be a little slower with their judgments on oral law, or their I get saying that's not in the Torah. I get that, and there's a truth to that. But sometimes you need to hold back because maybe it is, and maybe you just don't know where it is. And by that, it means you may be familiar with a lot of the text, but until you start looking at the text fully in Hebrew and you start looking at it at the way some of these people are looking at it, you may find that some of these things actually are in the Torah, just not in the way you were looking at it. It's like if you're familiar with those pictures, right? Or like a Rorschach test. You got an ink blot or something, and different people see the same things, or it's more like those pictures where you look at it and on the surface it looks at one thing, and the longer you stare at it you see the other pictures within that. That's kind of like how the Torah is. On the surface you see the text, you see the one picture, but then when you begin to look at it a little longer you get to notice the other things in that drawing, and they begin to pop out at you. So a simple blanket statement, it's not in the Torah, and by that if you mean I read my English Bible and I couldn't find it, that doesn't mean it's not there, okay? It's really important to understand. So, okay, this text continues. It says, the rabbis taught if a proselyte was circumcised but had not performed the prescribed ritual ablution, and that's immersion, our Eliezer said, behold, he is a proper proselyte. For so we find that our forefathers were circumcised and had not performed the ritual ablution or immersion. If he performed the prescribed ablution but had not been circumcised, our Joshua said, behold, he is a proper proselyte, for we find that the mothers had performed ritual ablution but not had been circumcised. The sages, however, said whether he had performed ritual ablution but had not been circumcised, or whether he had been circumcised but had not performed the prescribed ritual ablution, he is not a proper proselyte unless he has been circumcised and has also performed the prescribed ablution. Now, I'm going to go into some more detail in a second, but I'm actually going to finish this out because it's important to finish this out. I'm just going to stop here for a second and say, now what you have, this is classic Talmudic text. You have Rabbi Eliezer, who was a Tanaim, a 1st century rabbi, and you have Rabbi Joshua, right, which would be Yehoshua. He lived a couple hundred years later. He's a 2nd century, 2nd or 3rd century rabbi. So they never really had an argument. A lot of times the Talmudic texts, they have two rabbis and it looks like they have an argument. They didn't even live in the same period. So you can see how things developed over time in these arguments, okay? Now, it doesn't mean that no one in the 1st century had Rabbi Yehoshua's opinion or Joshua's opinion, because they did. In fact, Paul the Apostle was more along those lines. But we're going to just go through the text and then I'll deal with it a little bit more in depth in a second. So it says, here we see the heart of the debate. Two rabbis, one from each side of the camp. Eliezer says circumcision is necessary, but immersion is not. And he bases his point on Sinai, saying they were circumcised without immersion. Now, in other words, they came and then they were eventually all circumcised under Joshua, right? Now, to get to the truth of the matter, however, from Elohim's perspective, a deeper look is needful. But that is not the topic at hand, okay? The topic at hand is this. The sages, or Hazal, represent those that potentially came after this debate, and they took the view that rather than fight, compromise, or inquire both. In other words, when I back up here this text, it says, the sages, however, said whether he had performed ritual ablution but had not been circumcised, or whether he had been circumcised but not had been performed the ritual ablution, he is not a proper proselyte unless he does both. Who are the sages? The sages are what we call the Hazal, those that possibly came after this debate, right? And they said rather than fight, rather than argue, should there be, this is the way a lot of modern Judaism goes, by the way. So someone has this point, someone has this point, they're opposing viewpoints. What do? We choose a middle option. So rather than try and figure out which one is correct, we'll just say both. It just solves the problem, right? Well, yes and no. And there are times where compromise like that can solve a problem, but if that's not the position that the Torah really supports, that sort of compromise is actually counterproductive. Okay, so this is where we arrive at in modern Judaism. And the problem is if the Torah doesn't support this view, it's not valid. So yeah, it's great. It's great that they settled the debate. We're not going to fight about it anymore. We're just going to require both, and that will be done. It's not so simple. So we continue through the text of the Talmud. Let our Joshua also infer from the forefathers, and let our Eliezer also infer from the mothers. And should you reply that a possibility may not be inferred from an impossibility, surely it may be retorted, it was taught by our Eliezer, said, whence it is deduced that the paschal lamb of later generations may be brought from Hulin, that is, a non-consecrated animals, only. Those in Egypt were commanded to bring a paschal lamb, and those of later generations were commanded to bring a paschal lamb. As the paschal lamb spoken of in Egypt could be brought from Hulin only, so may also the paschal lamb which had been commanded to later generations be brought from Hulin only. Said Arkiba to him, may a possibility be inferred from an impossibility? The other replied, although an impossibility is nevertheless proof of the importance and deduction from it may be made, but all agree that ritual ablution without circumcision is effective, and they only differ on circumcision without ablution. Our Eliezer infers from the forefathers, while our Joshua maintains that in the case of forefathers also ritual ablution was performed. Whence does he deduce it? If it be suggested from that which is written, Go unto the people and sanctify them today and tomorrow, and let them wash their garments. And if where the washing of garments is not required, ablution is required, how much more should ablution be required where the washing of garments is required? And it may be retorted that might have been a mere matter of cleanliness, it is rather from here. And Moses took the blood and sprinkled it on the people, and we have a tradition there must be no sprinkling without ritual ablution. That's a lot of text to go through. But we're gonna kind of unpack some of that, because when you go through some of that stuff, it's like, okay, what the heck are they saying? What does that go through? Okay, so we can see a bit of a wider argument. So allow me to explain it. So to get to the heart of the issue, what is required, a point is made that illustrates the view that just because we do something now doesn't mean that's the right way to do it. In other words, that whole story about the Paschal Lamb, where they diverge and start talking about the Passover, it's like we're talking about circumcision here. What does Passover have to do with circumcision? It's not so much what Passover itself has to do from circumcision, it's what they deduce from this. So in later generations, they determined that a Paschal Lamb needs to come from a kosher, sanctified source. It had to be grown up under the supervision of the priests and the Levites, or under certain rabbinic supervision. And if it wasn't, they couldn't accept that Paschal Lamb. And the rabbis in this argument are basically they're coming to the point saying, wait a minute. Yeah, we do that today, but remember back in Egypt, what Levites were there? What priests were there to observe the lambs growing up in Egypt? They took pagan lambs and used them for the Passover. And if that was okay, though today we would say you can't do that, then we must infer that it is possible. So we say an impossibility today, but actually, based on the Torah text, that actually is a possibility. So when we say something like, well, circumcision, today we require circumcision and immersion, there's no, this is the way you have to do it. It's like, wait a minute. When we go back and look through the text, and we find actually that, Abraham, allegorically we can say, when Abraham crossed over, right? He crossed through the waters to go into the land. He had an immersion, and he wasn't circumcised till he was 99 years old. Or we can say the people, they crossed through the Red Sea. They went through an immersion of sorts, even though the water didn't cover them, right? But even if you don't want to go there, here Rabbi Joshua gives an even more specific point. And he's saying the Torah commanded them when they gathered at Mount Sinai to wash their garments. And you think that how did they wash their garments? They certainly got wet when they washed their garments. They went down in the rivers and they had to wash their garments. It's not like they necessarily had washing machines, so their immersion was when they went down there and they washed their garments, that it would have been necessary to wash themselves. It doesn't necessarily make sense to wash your garment and then you're dirty if you're filthy, and then you go and wash your garment and put on clean garments on your filthy self too, right? So you're going to immerse yourself, you're going to clean your garments, and then you're going to be entirely clean, right? And then specifically within that text, they don't want you to think that it's just about cleanliness, but it's about ritual purity. So it's not just about washing the dirt off your garments, it's tying a physical action to a spiritual concept. And that's what immersion is about anyway. Immersion isn't about getting the physical dirt off your body. It's about cleansing yourself inward and then doing an outward action to mirror that inward reality. So at the end, it's taught from the Talmud that no matter what, whether a person is circumcised or uncircumcised, immersion in water is effective to make a proselyte. That's what the text says. The disagreement is on whether you can be circumcised and not immersed. So that's what the real argument ends up being about at the end. It doesn't necessarily start out that way, but the real argument in the end, it says all agree that immersion alone is sufficient to make a proselyte. disagreement is on whether or not circumcision is obligatory. So when we continue, it says, when he perceived that his we're going to go into Josephus here. Sorry, I lost my place here for a second. Okay, so we're going to go into the works of Josephus. This is from Antiquities of the Jews. And we're going to see, again, he represents a first century opinion on Jewish matters, because he was a contemporary of the apostles, just like Philo of Alexandria. So he relates this story in Antiquities of the Jews. It says, when he perceived that his mother was highly pleased, and this is referring about a certain king, with the Jewish customs, he made a haste to change and to embrace them entirely. And as he supposed that he could not be thoroughly a Jew unless he were circumcised, he was ready to have it done. But when his mother understood what he was about to do, she endeavored to hinder him from doing it, and said to him that this thing should bring him into danger, and that as he was a king, he would thereby bring himself into great odium amongst his subjects, when they should understand that he was so fond of rites that were to them strange and foreign, and they would never bear to be ruled over by a Jew. This was that she said to him, and for the present persuaded him to forbear. And when he had been related what he had said to Ananias, he confirmed what his mother had said. So Ananias was a Jew that he knew, and this Jew agreed with what his mother said. And when he had threatened to leave him unless he complied with him, he went away from him, and said that he was afraid lest such an action being once become public to all, he should lead himself be in danger of punishment for having been the occasion of it, and having been the king's instructor in the actions that were of ill reputation. In other words, the king had come to Ananias and wanted Ananias to circumcise him. And Ananias said, no, I'm not going to do that. I agree with what your mother said. If I do this thing for you, I'm afraid that your people will find out about it and want to kill me. So in other words, I appreciate your zeal for circumcision, but it's not necessary. And if I were to do this thing, I'd fear for my own life. And he said that he might worship God without being circumcised, even though he did resolve to follow the Jewish law entirely, which worship of God was of superior nature to circumcision. So in other words, this Ananias said that the worship of God was superior in nature to circumcision. That doesn't mean that Ananias' opinion was that circumcision wasn't entirely necessary or useful. It just meant that from Ananias' view, and it doesn't mean Ananias' view was right, but from Ananias, a Jewish person that lived in the first century, believed that this guy could be a believer and follow God in every other aspect and not be circumcised. So Paul was not alone in his view. Now the question is, what did Paul entirely teach about that? That's a whole other matter. Did Paul really think that you should never be circumcised ever? Well, that's something that we'll explore, but I will say that's a doubtful view. Okay, so this continues from the works of Josephus. It says, but afterwards, as he had not quite left off his desire of doing this thing, a certain other Jew that came out of Galilee, whose name was Eleazar, and who was esteemed very skillful in the learning of his country, persuaded him to do the thing, that is, be circumcised, right? For as he entered into a palace to salute him, and he found him reading the law of Moses, he said to him, Thou dost not consider, O king, that thou unjustly breakest the principle of those laws, and art injurious to God himself, by omitting to be circumcised? For thou oughtest not only to read them, but chiefly to practice what they enjoin thee. How long wilt thou continue uncircumcised? But if thou hast not yet read the law about circumcision, and dost not know how great an impiety thou art guilty of by neglecting it, read it now. And when the king had heard what he had said, he delayed the thing no longer, but retired to another room and sent for a surgeon and did what he was commanded him to do. So in other words, another Jewish man came along who claimed or who was considered to be more educated than the other one, And he said, wait a minute, you're going to go around here and you're going to read this law and you're going to talk about it, but you're not going to do the things therein. And maybe you don't know them. Go read about it. Once you read about it, you'll understand what I'm saying is right, and you'll go be circumcised. Again, this doesn't, at present, I'm not saying Ananias was wrong or right, or this other Jewish man was wrong or right, this Eleazar was wrong or right. What you're seeing is you're seeing two opinions, right? Much like we read in the Talmud. So now we need to explore some other elements. Okay, so we established that all agreed ritual immersion in water was considered sufficient to make a proselyte. That doesn't mean that circumcision was never on the table, or that a proselyte would never be circumcised. We're talking about the minimum point of entry for a Gentile to be considered a convert to the nation of Israel. In other words, what's the minimum requirement to begin the naturalization process, right? So in other words, if you were coming over to America and you wanted to become a citizen, you'd need to know what is the minimum requirement to start to becoming an American citizen. And you may find a variety of opinions, but you just basically need the legal rulings on that. You know, if you ask someone, they might say, well, my opinion is you need to learn the English language and, you know, maybe take some, some different kinds of classes or read some stuff about our history, and then you can, whatever. It only matters what the actual legal requirement of the land is, though, right? So now we're going to move on from that topic a little bit, because we're going to talk about first century Jewish sects, and again we're going to look at Josephus, some of the things that he says about them. He says this in Antiquities of the Jews: the Jews had for a great while had three sects of philosophy peculiar to themselves, the sect of the Essenes and the sect of the Sadducees, and the third sort of opinions was that of those called the Pharisee, of which sects, although I have already spoken in the second book of the Jewish War, yet I will a little touch upon them now. So he said for a period they had only three sects, and we know that actually there ended up being more, and Josephus even talks about them. He'll often talk about the Zealot or the Sicarii. So there's, principally speaking, at least five, and then of course the followers of the way would be another sect. But principally speaking, both the followers of the way, more or less, and the Zealot were actually a subgroup of Pharisee. They were not really entirely their own group. So the Pharisee. Now for the Pharisees, they live meanly and despise delicacies in diet, and they follow the conduct of reason and what they prescribes them as good for them to do, and they think they ought earnestly to strive to observe reason's dictates for practice. They also pay respect to such as are in years, nor are they as bold as to contradict them in anything which they have introduced, and they have determined that all things are done by fate, and they do not take away the freedom from men of acting as they think fit, since their notion is that it hath pleased God to make a temperament whereby what he wills is done, but so that the will of man can act virtuously and viciously. They also believe that souls have an immortal rigor in them, and that under the earth there will be rewards or punishment according as they have lived virtuously or viciously in this life. And the latter are to be detained in an everlasting prison, but the former shall have power to revive and live again, on account of which doctrines they are able to greatly to persuade the body of the people, and soever they do about divine worship, prayers, and sacrifices, they perform them according to their direction, insomuch that the cities give great attention to them on account of their entire virtuous conduct, both in actions of their lives and their discourses also. So in other words, Pharisees believe in the resurrection of the dead. They believe in honoring the elderly, so much so that things that the elders have enacted before them, they try not to contradict. They believe in the sovereignty of God, but also man has a will within that. And they believe, in reward and punishment in the afterlife. Okay. Yeah. All right, Sadducee. But the doctrine of the Sadducees is this: the souls die with their bodies, nor do they regard their observation of anything besides what the law enjoins them. For they think it an instance of virtue to dispute with those teachers of philosophy whom they frequent. But this doctrine is received but by few, yet by those still of greatest dignity. But they are able to do almost nothing of themselves, for when they become magistrates, as they are unwillingly and by force sometimes obliged to be, they addict themselves to the notions of the Pharisees, because the multitude would not otherwise bear them. So the Sadducees, and again, both these players you see predominantly in the New Testament, they believe their soul dies with the body. They don't believe in any afterlife. They don't regard the observation of anything beside what the law enjoins them. In other words, they're people that say, it's not in the Bible, it's not in the law, it's not in the Torah, I'm not doing it. That's what a Sadducee is. So as a believer in Mashiach, if your sole perspective is, I don't read it in my English Bible, so because I don't see it in my English Bible, I reject it, that's kind of a Sadducean position, just so you know, because if that's the case, you have no Mashiach. You're not gonna read your English text and find anywhere where it talks about the Mashiach. There's very few places that talk about the Mashiach or Christ specifically. So the whole notion that that the prophet like unto Moses, and the whole notion the suffering servant of Isaiah, the whole notion that all that's talking about the same person comes through oral position. It comes through someone telling you, or your own observations. They seem to all be speaking of the same person. There's nothing to say that emphatically. There's nothing in the Tanakh that you're going to read that emphatically says this is all talking about the same people. All these messianic prophecies, they're all talking about the same individual or individuals. It's just lacking. So that's why the Sadducees rejected it, because they're going to say the Messiah is not even really in the Torah. And if you don't believe a Sadducee would say that, go out and look at many modern strains of Judaism, because many of them, Reform and Reconstructionists, reject the idea of a personal or individual Messiah. Many of them talk about a messianic age, and some of them don't even hold to that notion. So again, for they think it an instant of virtue to dispute with those teachers of philosophy whom they frequent, so they like to argue. That's a characteristic of a Sadducee. And there weren't many Sadducees. There were a number, but they weren't as great, right? And unfortunately, they're not able to do anything themselves. They often fought, and when they were required to take higher position, they would go and they would addict themselves to the notions of the Pharisees. In other words, they would go find out what the Pharisees' opinions on things were, and then they would use those. It's kind of pathetic, really, in a sense, that the Sadducean position is, well, we're only going to do what the law says, but now I'm in a position of power, and now I have to really do things and deal with people, and people aren't going to deal with me because of my Sadducean position. Let me go find out what the Pharisees say, and I'll use that, and then the people will listen.
That's how they did it there. The Pharisees, they were in control of the synagogues. They were all and the people wouldn't have tolerated them if they had not followed their rules.
Right. Yeah, exactly. The people would have rejected their leadership because they weren't. The masses were inclined towards the Pharisees and the Pharisaic position. So we're at Pharisees and Sadducees. Sadducees and Pharisees continued. So this is more from Josephus. What I now explain is this, that the Pharisees had delivered to the people a great many observances by succession from their fathers. This is, right, the traditions of the fathers, which are not written in the laws of the Moses. And for that reason it is that the Sadducees reject them and say that we are to esteem those observances to be obligatory which are in the written word, but are not to observe what are derived from the tradition of our forefathers. And concerning these things, it is that great disputes and differences have arisen round them, why the Sadducees are able to persuade none but the rich, and have not the populace obsequious to them, but the Pharisees have the multitude on their side. But about these two sects and that of the Essenes I have treated accurately in the second book of Jewish Affairs. Now, one of the reasons why this is important, other than just to give you a greater backdrop to the Gospels is the Apostle Paul. Did he say that touching the law or concerning the law, I'm a Sadducee? No, he said he's a Pharisee, right? So don't you think it's important to understand what the Pharisees thought, how they approached the Torah, and the differences between Sadducees and Pharisees? Because it would make sense now if Paul said, now that I believe in Yeshua as Messiah, I became a Sadducee because I have now rejected the oral law. That would be the position. But if he were to take that position, you'd understand that he would have to reject the Messiah, because if he goes by the written law only, Yeshua would not be the Messiah. Yeshua is only the Messiah based on their Pharisaic position and interpretation of the Scriptures, because of the way they looked at the prophecies and how they tied them together, and how you tie the word together and say, yes, this points to Yeshua. From a Sadducean position, it's not possible. That doesn't mean you couldn't be a Sadducee that had a variance of interpretation. But again, Apollos didn't come to the conclusion, I am now a believer in Yeshua, I am now a Sadducee. Yeah, in multiple places. So we're going to go a little bit about the Essenes to give you an idea of another party, because it's also important, because even though they're not mentioned by name, they did exist in the Scriptures. They're alluded to in places. So the Essene, the doctrine of the Essene is this, that all things that are ascribed to God, they teach the immortality of the soul and esteem that rewards of a righteous are to be earnestly striven for, and what they send, what they have dedicated to God into the temple, they do not offer sacrifices, because they have more pure lustrations of their own, on which they account are excluded from the common court of the temple, but offer their sacrifices themselves. Yet is their course of life better than that of other men, and they entirely addict themselves to husbandry. It also deserves our admiration how much they exceed all their men that are addict themselves to virtue, and this in righteousness, and are indeed to such a degree that hath never appeared among any other men, neither Greeks nor barbarians, no, not for a little time, so hath it endured a long while among them. This is demonstrated by that institution of theirs which will not suffer anything to hinder them from having all things in common, so that a rich man enjoys no more of his own wealth than he who has nothing at all. And there are all about 4,000 men that live in this way, and neither marry wives, nor are they desirous to keep servants, as thinking the latter tempts men to be unjust, and the former gives the handle to domestic quarrels. But as they live by themselves, they minister one to another. They also appoint certain stewards to receive the incomes of their revenues, and of the fruit of the ground, such as are good men and priests, who are to get their corn and their food ready for them. They, none of them, differ from the others of the Essenes in any way of living, but they do most resemble those Dacae, who are called Palistei, that is, dwellers in the cities. So in other words, what happened there? In other words, the Essenes, they were very similar to Pharisees in many ways, but very different in other ways. One of the things is they forbid marrying, and they didn't marry. The other thing is by and large they rejected the temple and the temple practices, and many of them were possibly descendants of the Zadokite priesthood, maybe not, but they saw the temple as corrupt in their day, and so they rejected it, and they went and lived in their own isolated communities apart from the temple practice. So that was one of the major things from them. Doesn't mean they didn't interact with Judaism at large. And as it says here, they sent offerings to the temple, but they wouldn't go up, and they had their own version of a sacrificial system. Okay, so that gives you a little bit more backdrop to the first century. Now we're going to talk a little bit about the Galatians. So we've covered who Paul is, right? We covered some things that he had been taught and who the players were in the Pharisaic world that shaped the viewpoints of first century Judaism. And most Christians do not realize that the New Covenant Scriptures have a lot to say about who the Galatians were, which we can take and then use this history to help inform us about them. So in other words, the book of Galatians isn't the only place to learn about the Galatians, believe it or not. So Acts 16:1 through 6, it says, Then he came to Derbe and Lystra, and this is Paul, and behold, a certain disciple was there named Timotheus, the son of a certain woman, which was a Jewess, and believed, but his father was a Greek, which was well reported of the brethren that were at Lystra and Iconium. Him would Paul have to go forth with him, and took and circumcised them because of the Jews which were in those quarters, for they knew all that his father was a Greek. And as they went through the cities, they delivered them the decrees for to keep that were ordained of the apostles and elders which were at Jerusalem. And so were the churches established in faith and increased in number daily. Now when they had gone through Phrygia and the region of Galatia, they were forbidden of the Holy Ghost to preach the word in Asia. So Galatia is the area of Asia Minor containing Derbe, that's listed up there, Lystra, that was listed up there, Iconium. It also contains Antioch of Pisidia, to name just a few places. So we're going to get some insight into these people and who they were and what they thought. Now, there were Jews in these areas, and since we're on the topic, I think I would be remiss not to point out the fact that Paul circumcised Timothy. So he certainly wasn't against circumcision, because he had Timothy circumcised. Now, some say, well, he did that because the Jews there wouldn't accept him if he wasn't circumcised, so he was trying to protect his ministry or something like that. Well, that's certainly one way to read the text. Another way to read the text, which is probably far more accurate, would be to know that those Jews would not circumcise Timothy because his father was a Greek. And so because of the ruling opinions of the day, they would have considered possibly Timothy a Gentile product, or at worst, his father may even have been against it to some degree. It's not clear. Another thing to understand too is the Greek text here, typically speaking, the Greek word for Greek is Hellen, and Hellen can refer to a Greek or Hellenized Jew. So theoretically it's possible that Timothy's father was a Jew, but he was a Hellen. In other words, he was Hellenized. He basically abandoned Jewish practice to live his life as a Greek. The text is not clear. There's no way for us to know for sure one way or the other. But regardless, the implication is that the Jewish men would not circumcise Timothy, and therefore Paul circumcised Timothy. Not because to protect his ministry to please men, because we know that Paul, by and large, was not a man-pleaser, right? So, in other words, why wouldn't he suggest to Titus that he be circumcised? Titus at one point wasn't compelled to be circumcised, and we'll explore that much later, but wasn't compelled to be circumcised. Why wouldn't Paul say, well, Titus, even though you're a Gentile, even though you're a Greek, might be a good idea to be circumcised because the Jews would take you more seriously. If he didn't do that to Titus, why would he do that to Timothy? Simply because his mother was a Jewess? Why would that matter? Right? It wouldn't. So it's a foolish position to take to say that it was only because of ministry, because it doesn't wash with the rest of the scripture. So Acts 14:1 through 6. And it came to pass in Iconium that they were both together in the synagogues of the Jews, and so spake that a great multitude both of Jews and also of Greeks believed. But when the unbelieving Jews stirred up the Gentiles, and made their minds evil affected against the brethren, long time therefore abode they, speaking boldly in the Lord, which they gave testimony unto the word of his grace, and granted signs and wonders to be done by their hands. But the multitude of the city was divided, in part held with the Jews, and part with the apostles. And when there was assault made both of the Gentiles and also the Jews with their rulers, to use them despitefully and to stone them, they were aware of it, and fled unto Lystra and Derbe, the cities of Lycaonia, and unto the region that lieth about. So Iconium had a Jewish population, complete with at least one synagogue. So there was a Jewish connection in Galatia. But there was also a large pagan population as well. So it says, Howbeit, as the disciples stood round about, he rose up and came into the city the next day, and departed with Barnabas to Derbe. So you see where Paul's traveling through Galatia, right? Through the text, it's telling us. So here you see Lycaonia has a large pagan population, right? I skipped things here. Yeah, I think missing a piece of text here. Yep. Oh well. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I'm missing a piece of text here from Acts, but I can relate. And that is, they end up going there to Lycaonia, and there they end up. Paul sees a man who has faith to be healed, and he raises him up, and the man walks. And the people lose their mind, and they end up declaring Paul and Barnabas to be pagan gods, and they try to worship them, and they get so distressed they rend their garments, right? So that lets us know that there's a large pagan population in there. The pagan gods in particular are named after the stars because Romans and Greeks worshiped the stars, and they even believed they could influence personality and day-to-day affairs. Today most people are aware of this same practice, which is called a horoscope or astrology, right? So there were Galatian pagans who worshiped the stars or celestial bodies and observed times and seasons based on these things. So Paul very directly calls this vain, that they worship nothing, worthlessness, and this of course is post-Christ. So why would he not just spin this and sanctify the pagan as Catholic doctrine? In other words, when they worshipped him, he could have just spun it around and said, no, let's just inject Christ into all of this and be done with it. Instead, he says their worship is vain or worthless. Okay, so now, someone might say, but wait, that's only one side of Apollos, right? That's only one side of Paul. Didn't he say the Torah was dung and nailed to the cross? And to go back to that is to fall from grace. So to answer that question, I'm going to take us right back to where we were earlier with Peter. Peter says that account the long suffering of our Lord as salvation, even as our beloved brother Apollos, also according to the wisdom given unto him, is written unto you, as also in all of his letters, speaking in them of these things, in which are some things hard to be understood, which they that are unlearned and unstable wrest, as they do the other scriptures, and unto their own destruction. Right? So Peter says that, again, people misunderstand Paul, and that leads to destruction. So here's some things real quick to go through before we close this segment of the introduction. And that is the phrase works of the law. So most people know Galatians, where it says 2:16, knowing that a man is not justified through the works of Torah, but through the faith of Yeshua Mashiach. Even we have believed in Yeshua Mashiach, that we might be justified through faith of Mashiach and not through works of Torah. For through the works of Torah no flesh shall be justified. So there we go, cut and dry, right? We just read it. So doing the Torah is bad, right? That's obviously what that says. So here's some important things to note through the text. 1, this is for the purpose of justification only, being right with God. In other words, this doesn't say don't follow the Torah. It's just saying if you're using the Torah as a means to make yourself right with God, in other words, to remove your sins, it doesn't. And the reason why is because God rewards good to the good and bad to the bad. So that means if you did a bad deed, God doesn't work on a system where now you do a good deed, you wipe away that bad deed. That's not how repentance works. Repentance works through a heart change that a good deed manifests the proof of that inward change. That good deed doesn't wipe out the bad deeds. It's your inward heart change that led to doing the good deed. That wipes out the bad deed. That's repentance. God doesn't work on a system of scales where if I do enough good to outweigh all the bad I do, so every bad thing I do 2 good deeds, then I'll always be right with God. That's pretty simple math. I mean, heck, then I could live any way I wanted, right? I could say, okay, I did something bad today. Let me go do 2 good things, and then I know I'm square. And I better make sure that I have 2 good things ready to do any given day, because I could die at any moment. So I know I'm going to go do something bad. Let me go rob a bank, but then I'll give it all to charity, right? And then I'll go mow the poor widow down the street's lawn. Boom. Pretty straightforward, right? No, that's not how it works. Now that, I had you going, you thought, well, that's great. Yeah, simple. Yeah, I ruined it. No, it's not how it works. You do something good, God's going to reward that good. You do something bad, you're going to get something bad for it. Wah, wah, wah. How unfair, right? No, that's justice. That's God's view of justice. So you can't use the Torah as a means of doing something right if you've done wrong things before. You got to pay for the wrong things that you did. So this is saying you can't use the Torah as a means to make yourself right with God purely, right? The issue is man isn't justified. The issue of man isn't justified is because no flesh shall be justified. That's no natural self. In other words, every man has a bit of animal within him, and he can't be justified through the Torah. That your natural self can't. I'm going to explain that a little bit more in a second, but just note that it says no flesh shall be justified, and there's a reason why he makes that clarification. And then the last point I want to make here is the word but. Many translations have but there, but in the Greek text it's not one word. Typically if that was but, it would be a Greek word called de or di or Allah, and it's not either of those. It's actually two words, and the words are in, may, and there's strong as numbers there for you in the Greek, and it actually means which. It should actually be translated if not. So it says, knowing that a man is not justified through works of Torah, if not through the faith of Yeshua Mashiach. In other words, if without faith, specifically Yeshua's faith, but also without faith, the works of the Torah are essentially meaningless. And that is the important thing to understand what Paul is saying. Paul's not saying faith good, Torah bad. He's saying without the faith of Yeshua, your Torah observance is meaningless. Okay, and we're going to bring Romans into account to help clarify Galatians. It says, because the carnal mind is enmity against God, for it is not subject to the Torah of God, neither indeed can it be. So when Paul says no flesh can be justified from the Torah, he's saying that because he already created the position that your natural self, your base animal self, can never be subject to the law of God. The animal within you, your sin nature, will always refuse to follow the Torah. So it's really funny to me when you talk to people, specifically Christians in general, that get really inflamed when you talk to them about following and subjecting themselves to the Torah, and they talk about how spiritual they are, and then the next minute they're so angry that you would propose that they should follow the Torah. And it's like, do you realize the spiritual person you claim to be is now being subjected to the animal or your sin nature within you? That is what is rebelling the notion of submitting to the Torah. You are not being led by the Spirit at that point. You are being led by your flesh, and that is what's rebelling, and you need to put that to death to follow the will of God. Romans 2:13 says, for not the hearers of the Torah are just before God, but the doers of the Torah shall be justified. Both positions being in direct opposition to each other can't be true. In other words, it can't be bad to follow the Torah, but yet when you follow it, you're going to be justified. The issue Paul made in Galatians is only your flesh, your natural self, cannot be subject to the will of God. And so, but if you do the Torah, you will be justified. That's a true statement. And we know that because of Romans 3:31. Do we make void the law through faith? God forbid. You can't say I have faith and I refuse to follow the Torah, because that's making the Torah void through faith. Yea, we establish the Torah, or we put it in practice. And we're going to go through this one last thing before we close here, and that is Philippians 3. Again, it says, finally, my brethren, rejoice in the Lord. To write the same things to you, to me indeed, is not grievous, but for you it is safe. Beware of dogs, beware of evil workers, beware of mutilators of the flesh. For we are the circumcision which worship God in the Spirit and rejoice with Mashiach Yeshua and have no confidence in the flesh. Right? Though I might also have confidence in the flesh, if any man thinks that he has where he might trust in the flesh, I more so. Circumcised the 8th day, of the stock of Israel, of the tribe of Benjamin, a Hebrew of Hebrews, is touching the Torah, a Pharisee. Again, Paul's saying he's a Pharisee. He has no confidence in the flesh, but if others are going to claim confidence, he can too, based on these things. He says, concerning the zeal, persecuting the assembly, concerning righteousness which is in the Torah, within the Torah, blameless. But what things were advantage to me, these I counted loss through Mashiach. Yet doubtless, and I count all things but loss for the excellency of the knowledge of Mashiach Yeshua my Lord, for whom I have suffered the loss of all things, and do count them but dung, that I may win Mashiach and be found in him, not having my own righteousness which is of Torah, but that which is of through faith of Mashiach, the righteousness which is of God through faith. So people come away from this and they say, see, Paul's saying the Torah is dung and that it and such and such. No, that's not what he's saying. I've highlighted specific texts here to help. But what things were advantage to me, these I counted loss through Mashiach. So he had certain things that were an advantage or profitable to him that he lost through being a follower of Mashiach. What were they? Well, you can't lose being circumcised on the 8th day. When he became a believer in Mashiach, did his foreskin grow back? No. You can't lose that. When he became a believer in Mashiach, did he stop being an Israelite? Did he stop being of the tribe of Benjamin? Did he stop being a Hebrew of Hebrews? Did he stop being a Pharisee? No, he can't physically lose those things. Now, he could technically change his mind and stop being a Pharisee. That's the only one that he could change. Being a Hebrew of Hebrews, he's talking about how he excelled himself for the zeal of his people. He may have lost that zeal, but he can't go back and change those things that were true. No, these things caused him to have advantage or profit, and he lost those advantages that he had from those things when he became a follower of Mashiach. How do we know this? Well, because before he was a follower of Mashiach, he could go up to the high priest and the Sanhedrin and the chief people, and he could get them to give him letters that gave him permission to go and pursue and persecute the Jews. Do you think after he became a follower of Mashiach and they found that out, do you think he could go back and do that? No. He lost those things. Those are the things that he lost. He's not calling the Torah dung. He's saying all the advantages he gained, sitting at the feet of Gamaliel and becoming a rabbi and having chief seats in the synagogue and all these sorts of things, he lost all that. But guess what? He got new things in the messianic synagogues and the people that he raised up in that. He gained something else. He gained something different. So in the previous world he was in, it was all pride of man, pride of the flesh, my accreditations, my degrees, all these things that made me great. In Mashiach, it was his servitude and how he lived his life and actually applying the Torah. That was advantage. And says, so then he could say, yeah, doubtless I count all things but loss for the excellency of the knowledge of Mashiach Yeshua my Lord, for I have suffered the loss of all things. Yeah, he probably lost home. He probably lost property. He probably lost family members. And he says, I do count them but dung, that I may win Mashiach and be found in him, not having my own righteousness, which is of the Torah. Notice he doesn't say my own righteousness that is within the Torah. No, he says of the Torah. He's saying something different. But that which is through faith in Mashiach, the righteousness which is of God through faith. So it's irresponsible for anybody to come to some conclusion that Paul is saying that the Torah is dung, because in many places, like we just read, he said, by faith you establish it. So by faith you establish dung? Is that really what you're saying? People need to be a little slower and a little bit more critical in their thinking. And so that will eventually continue line by line through Galatians. So there you have our basic overview or introduction, which is enough information for just about anybody to then take into the text and to challenge their own assumptions that they have on what they think it's